Hi, I'm Chuck DeVore. I'm the Vice President of National Initiatives at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and it's my distinct honor and pleasure today to be joined by two individuals who know a lot about what's going on right now with regard election integrity, not only in the state of Texas, but also nationally. As panelists today, we have Texas Senator Bryan Hughes, who's served in the legislature now for about 20 years. He served for 14 years in the Texas House of Representatives, and for the last 5 years has been a Texas state senator. He practices law in his constituency out in East Texas, and more importantly for our discussion, has been the leader from his purchase chairman of the Texas State Affairs Committee. He's been the leader of filing the most comprehensive election reform bills in the state of Texas, a number of different vehicles, I think some of which have actually already been signed by the governor, but of course, one that right now that is pending because our House Democrats broke quorum by fleeing to Washington, D.C. Also joining us today is Jessica Anderson. She runs Heritage Action, very important adjunct to the Heritage Foundation. They're kind of the elections arm of the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, she worked in the Trump administration at the Office of Management and Budget. And before that, had a pretty extensive career, not only with the Heritage Foundation, but also with writing Wall Street Journal, The Hill, USA Today. In fact, recognized for her work with being named one of the 30 Under 30 awards, the Buckley Award winner as well for conservative leadership. So she's someone who has shown an amazing talent for politics and public policy from a very early start of her career. And so with that, if I could, I'd like to start with Senator Hughes about the current state of play, not only with the legislation that has been proposed in Austin, but also this extraordinary effort by Democrats to block any consideration by fleeing and breaking a quorum. I guess I'll start off by asking, during your career in the House, didn't this also happen back in 2003 when you were a relatively new Texas representative? As I recall, the Democrats fled in 2003 as well.
That's exactly right, Assemblyman, and I'm glad to be here to talk about it today. Thank you for having us. Yeah, I was a brand new member of the House back in 2003, and the issue at that time was redistricting. And so the Democratic members of the Texas House left the state, fled to Oklahoma, Ardmore, Oklahoma at the time, and they stayed until the end of the session so as to kill a redistricting bill. And so Governor Perry immediately called us back into a special session. And then the Senate Democrats left. They went to New Mexico. They stayed for the full 30 days of that special session. That session ended, they came back. Governor Perry called us back for another special session, and we passed the bill. It's hasn't happened to my knowledge since that time, at least not that scale. Throughout Texas history, from time to time, this has happened for a day or two, maybe people for various reasons, but on this scale, leaving the state, and certainly with this kind of fanfare, this is new ground.
Yeah, you say fanfare. It seems to me that the messaging coming out of Washington, D.C. Hasn't been the most favorable. You have these photographs of members on a private jet without their masks per Federal Aviation Administration regulations. And now, unfortunately, we see that first three, then another two members say that they've tested positive for COVID-19. Senator Hughes, how long do you suppose they'll be able to hold out? And tell us a little bit about what they claim is the reason why they've left town versus what's actually in the bill that they are protesting.
Well, Chuck, folks I'm hearing from across the political spectrum here in Texas are not happy about members of the legislature leaving their post, fleeing the state, abandoning their responsibilities. We have debates, we hash it out, and we take a vote. Sometimes I win, sometimes I lose, but we stay here and we fight. That's what we took an oath to do. So folks are upset about that. As far as the bill, you may have seen where the President of the United States said that this bill, this election accessibility and security bill, if I read it correctly, he said this is the biggest attack on democracy since the Civil War. I think that's what he said. And so here's what's in the bill. Here's what's in the bill. We talk about it making it easy to vote and hard to cheat, easy to vote. Now in Texas, if you're in line to vote, you show up before the polls close, but the lines are long. If you show up before the polls close, you will be allowed to vote. We've had that protection on election day, but not for early voting. And as you know, most folks now vote early. So Senate Bill 1 provides that protection. Also, if your work schedule does not allow you to vote, your employer must let you off work to vote. We've had that protection for election day, never for early voting. This bill adds it for early voting. We also have a mail ballot cure process. What does that mean? Many mail ballots are thrown out for technicalities. Now this gives the voter a chance to correct those problems and count that ballot. Folks who are entitled to vote, legitimate eligible voters, registered voters, need to be able to vote. Many other provisions of the bill along those lines. We expand early voting hours. We expand weekend hours. We include this in more counties around the state. We expand Sunday voting hours around the state. And so those are how the bill makes it easy to vote. The bill also has some important security measures because we've heard from people back home, people of all races, of all parties, of all regions of the state who've told us there are vote harvesters, ballot harvesters, paid political operatives who are stealing votes, who are misleading voters, coercing voters, telling voters they're going to assist them and show them how to use the machine, and then voting their way, not how the voters want to vote. People show up and they complain about these things. They testify about these things. And so we respond. And so this bill will crack down on vote harvesters, people trying to cheat, trying to steal ballots, trying to mislead voters, vulnerable voters, the elderly, those folks who don't speak English as well are the most preyed upon. There are protections for those people in this bill. We also standardize the procedures around the state, make sure those machines are being checked, make sure they're recording the votes accurately. We want all the votes to count. And that's basically what this is about. They're common sense reforms based on complaints we've heard from the people of Texas, red, yellow, black, and white around the state of various political parties and regions, problems they've complained about, we are trying to address.
So Jessica, thank you for that, Senator. Jessica Anderson of Heritage Action. How does this effort in Texas compare nationally? I know you've been kind of following what's been happening all over the country in places like Georgia and Florida. How is this effort in Texas comparing with those other states? And what have you kind of seen as this has been unfolding? What is unique about this?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me today. It's been remarkable to see the national Democrat response to the state bills that have moved through Georgia, through Iowa, through Florida, Arizona, and now Texas. And it seems that this trend of the progressive left trying to smear the bills, providing very misleading statements, as the senator just laid out, of the very facts of what the bills do. I mean, we saw this at the very beginning of the year when the left responded to the Georgia bill. The Georgia bill was passed. It had the same goal, making it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And everyone in the entire progressive left, including those in the Democrat Party, said, oh, these bills are Jim Crow 2.0. It's going to make it impossible for Georgians to vote. It actually limits voting. When you read the bill, it doesn't do any of that. It actually provides an easier way for people to get to the polls. It increases access on the weekends. And so this trend, I think, that we see from the national sphere of trying to smear the state bills, Texas is really the latest pawn in their larger goal of trying to fabricate, if you will, Chuck, this sort of crisis that just flat out doesn't exist in the states. States right now, the way our republic is built, have the right, the role, and the responsibility to protect and to safeguard our elections. They are doing this by passing these state accessibility and integrity bills. This is not voter suppression. This is not Jim Crow. It couldn't be further from it. And the political tactics or the political farce that we have seen on display, unfortunately, from the senator's colleagues the last 10 days is really sad. It's disheartening. Instead of a thoughtful debate, instead of trying to make the bill even better and even easier for Texans to vote and to limit the fraud, limit the cheating, they've instead walked away. And so I think Texas ends up being a big part of this national story because of how the progressive left is using it as a pawn to create this larger narrative that doesn't exist in the country, to push to have their larger goal, which is this federal takeover of elections, either through S1 or HR 4, whatever bill they go to next. And that's what these Texas lawmakers in DC this week ultimately are here to do. Instead of doing their job back home, they're lobbying to nuke the filibuster, even though they are filibustering, but they're lobbying to nuke the filibuster to pass HR 4 and have that democracy carve out for an election takeover.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that federal legislation. And I would argue, though, while it kind of almost looks like a filibuster, that's different, right? Because when you're filibustering, you actually have to be on the floor of the Senate to be able to continue to debate the bill that you're trying to delay and block. In this case, they just left town and are preventing a quorum from being established in the House. But let's talk a little bit about the so-called For the People Act, HR 1, S1, and then the John Lewis Act. I guess it's the HR 4 that you mentioned. So what I find fascinating is that if you look at the polling here in Texas, something on the order of 89% of Texans believe that we should have a voter ID for people who go to vote in person. And then if you ask about mail-in voting and whether or not we should try to have the same safeguards for mail-in votes as we do for in-person voting, 81% of Texans believe that that's not an unreasonable thing to put your driver's license number or your state ID number or the last four of your social security number inside of a privacy flap in that ballot return envelope. And yet, if you look at HR 1 and S1 and HR 4, as I see it, this is an attempt to federalize what I call California standards, if by standards you mean no standards at all, on all 50 states. And I know a little bit about this, having been a California lawmaker, but if you look at California law that they're patterning this after, there's no meaningful voter ID at all. There's no checks for eligibility to vote, for example, whether someone is a citizen or not. There's near universal mail-in balloting. I think in the last election cycle, 87% of Californians voted by mail, again, with zero ID required. Very poor list maintenance in California, a lot of dead people, a lot of people who've moved out of state, and of course, people who are likely not even eligible to vote. And that's what they're trying to impose nationwide. And so, it seems to me that this is kind of giving away what it is that they're really after, right? Can you explain a little bit more, Jessica, how what are the odds of the federal Congress pushing out these amazingly weakening of election integrity nationwide through passage of any of these bills?
Well, Democrat leadership here in Congress has made HR 1, S1, potentially HR 4, their priority pieces of legislation for this Congress. It is not by accident that they started with these bills and they named them S1, HR 1, meaning the first and most significant priority. So from the Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris perspective, this is the most important thing that they can do. It's their legacy. And you were right to detail the specifics that we see in the 800 plus pages of HR 1, because it is a systematic takeover of state elections, and it rolls back every single state bill. So even if Texas is successful in passing their election integrity and accessibility bill, in the next 30 days, it would be completely mute and overcome by HR 1. It would strip any state's voter integrity laws, voter ID. It would provide a pathway for illegal immigrants to show up to this country on a Friday and be able to vote on a Tuesday. And there are no safeguards to ensure the sanctity and the integrity at the ballot box. they have made clear what their end goal is. And it surfaces, I think, largely in how they couldn't get S1 across the finish line. So then they quickly pivoted to HR 4. This is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It looks specifically at the VRA. And the goal of this bill is one and the same as S1, which is the federal takeover of our election system. HR 4 just gets there in a different way, in that it requires every state, if they are to make any state election law changes, they would need to go through a process called pre-clearance, where those changes would need to be made and yay or nay, voted up or down by the DOJ. So the construct that the progressive left has created is to say states have no authority on their election laws. Local and state officials are mute. They're completely taken out of the picture, and you have a federalized, bureaucratic, progressive Democrat DC hybrid that now is in charge of all election laws across the country, regardless of any laws currently on the books. So that is their priority. They have reached somewhat of a stall out on the tarmac, if you will. They've got a field hearing today in Atlanta, Georgia, that the Senate Rules has traveled down to discuss the audacity of the Georgia bill to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. They are then going to meet with Democrat leaders and the Texas delegation here in Washington this week. All of this to provide pressure to say, see, states don't know what they're doing. We need to override that. And to be able to pass S1 or to pass H4, you have to nuke the filibuster. So their argument is, even if you can't stomach a full abolition of the filibuster, at least just have a democracy carve out for the sake of an election federal takeover. And so it's their number one goal. I think the jury's out, if you will, about whether or not they'll be successful here. But just the fact that they have resorted to such of a charade coming from Texas and using the Texas state lawmakers in their charade shows me they're getting desperate. They're getting desperate because people like Senator Manchin and Tester and Sinema and other more moderate Democrats have expressed pause and concern to the route that they're taking for this federal overreach of our elections.
Hey, Jessica, one more quick question before we go to questions from the audience. You had mentioned something about these federal bills that I had forgotten. So these bills would require same-day registration. Did I understand to hear you correctly that's what it would impose, same-day registration?
That's right. S1 has same-day voter registration allowances across the country. And because it doesn't include any voter ID provision, right, or confirmation of citizenship, you can very easily see the pathway for an illegal immigrant to enter the country on a Thursday or Friday, be bused to a polling location on Tuesday, no citizenship credibility, and same-day walk-in registration. So, right, I would encourage us to point out exactly what these bills do. Read them for ourselves. It's 800 pages, but even still, you get the heart of what their goal is here.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for folks to understand about this same-day registration. I know that in California, which is the kind of the template for what they're trying to do federally, it's on a complete honor system. And what ends up happening is voters, when they register to vote, simply check a box that they swear or affirm that they are eligible to vote. And of course, there's never a check on that. And as a result, when you combine that with the motor voter law from the 90s, from the Clinton administration era, that uses, for example, DMVs, Department of Motor Vehicles around the country to try to link getting people registered along with the bureaucratic effort to get a driver's license, then you ended up with, at least out in California, a lot of people being automatically signed up and registered, even without anything in the way of a check on their eligibility. So as we move into questions now, and this is certainly something, Senator Hughes, that we saw deployed by Democrats on the House floor, certainly, as well as I think a lot of the testimony. We heard this constantly, that people were claiming that these election integrity measures that you and some of your colleagues have sponsored are racist. That there's somehow the reimposition of Jim Crow. I know the President Biden, I think, called it James Eagle or something like that, as if to say that it was far worse. What's the best argument that can be used against these individuals who claim that these election integrity bills to try to ensure free and fair elections are somehow racist?
Chuck, first we would say to folks, read the bill, because those claims you're describing are reckless and they are false. And let me stress this. There's a county commissioner out on bond in my district right now. There are investigations in the Rio Grande Valley and across the state. In so many of these cases, the folks who brought the complaints happen to be minorities. They happen to be African Americans or Latinos. And so should we ignore their cries because they don't fit the narrative coming out of Washington? So this bill and the security measures in this bill are in response to complaints, to sworn testimony we've heard from folks around the state, many of them people of color, who said, this is how they tried to cheat me. This is how the ballot harvester misled me, told me I was voting differently than I was. These complaints come from all across the state, and many of the vulnerable voters who are being taken advantage of are people of color, and we're going to stand up for them. And I would think if we look at that record and see where the complaints come from, it sheds a lot of light on the truth about this bill.
We have another question, and I'd like to toss this question to both of you, starting with Jessica. The question is, what can the everyday person do to help in this battle to preserve our free and fair elections?
Well, it's a great question. And I'm so glad that someone is even thinking to do that right now. I would say the first and foremost thing to do is to support your legislators. Whether you are in a state like Texas, that's right in the middle of the battle, or you're in a state like Florida, Arizona, Iowa, Georgia, that passed an election integrity package, activists need to be willing to call our state legislators just in the same way that we call our federal members of Congress. Call them, tell them, thank you for passing these bills, support them, let them know that you're going to defend the bill. We've got some great resources available for how to do that with myth and fact sheets and talking points, all available at saveourelections.com. You can click on your state and download it from there. Or if you're in a state that is like Tennessee, or Alabama or Missouri or Arkansas, other states that are looking at different provisions like this to pass, encourage your legislators to take this on in the next legislative session next year. Use the template, use the leadership of states like Texas in getting this done, and use that momentum going forward. So if you're in a state outside of Texas, I think there's plenty that you can do. In Texas right now, I would say, and I certainly defer to the senator, but I think legislators, in particular those conservative legislators, need to hear encouragement. They need to hear support. They need to hear that the constituents across the state are with them, not to back down from this fight, and to finish the job that they were sent to Austin to do. And we can do that as conservatives, be that echo chamber of support around the legislature.
Senator Hughes?
Well said. For those of us here in Texas, Senate Bill 1, that's the election integrity bill. It's about accessibility and security. Both are important. So they used to say there's no evidence of voter fraud. And then the left began to say there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. Our question to them has been, how much fraud is okay? Of course, the answer is none. How much fraud is okay? None. How much suppression is okay? None. That's why this bill makes it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Both are equally important. And so, as Jessica said, if folks in Texas can contact us and let us know if you support Senate Bill 1, it will encourage those reps and senators who are like-minded, and will cause all of us to take a look at what's in the bill. The government still works for the people in America, and getting in touch with your representative still makes a difference.
So the next question, and again, I think I'd like to ask both of you to respond to this one, starting with Senator Hughes. The question is, what do the panelists believe will be the ultimate outcome of this dramatic walkout? And before you begin to answer, Senator Hughes, as I look at it, the governor, of course, can call a special session after special session. So we know that this may not be the only one, number one. Number two, as I recall, the governor vetoed Article 10 which is the legislative funding for both lawmakers and for staff. And that runs out, I think, at the end of August. Number three is if you look within Texas, and I'd like Jessica certainly to comment on this for what it's looking like in DC, but within Texas itself, I was rather surprised to see that all of the major metropolitan newspapers are not really looking very kindly on this walkout by the Democrats. I mean, they may not be entirely in favor of the legislation proposed by Republicans, but they're also taking a dim view of the Democrats walking out and breaking quorum. So where do you see this ultimately leading to, Senator Hughes?
Chuck, I believe you explained it very well. When this happened before, back in 2003, of course, the whole House had to face the voters in 2004. Now, I'm one who stayed on the job and didn't leave the state, but as I was campaigning, knocking doors, the one question I got more than any other was, did you leave the state? Did you stay and do your job? Folks care about that. It's a visceral reaction. Now, different districts are different, but certainly suburban districts, swing districts, everyday people get that you should stay and show up for work. So this is a factor. I think it's going to put pressure on some of our friends to come back. And again, it's between them and their constituents. But I believe the longer they stay, the more difficult it gets. They will return to Texas at some point. They have jobs and families. And so when they do, we look forward to the governor calling us back for another special session. And we'll stay as long as we have to and come back as many times as we have to get this done. It's important work to give these protections to every voter all across the state.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I really have been grappling with it myself because I don't know that Texas Democrats got on that plane with an end game in mind. I truly think they're going 24 hours at a time, and that's evidenced by, I think, some of the communications and PR nightmare that they just have stumbled into. And so in a lot of ways, their end game is not with just Texas, it's with this larger federal overreach. But even still, I mean, this is 30 days that Texas lawmakers that have other part-time or full-time jobs are away from it. So it's not only their job as a legislator, but their job back home that's supporting their family. I don't know of a single job where you could take off 30 days and not have retribution. So I think the senator is right. At a certain point, money's going to talk. And that might be the best asset that the governor has, that conservatives have, to pull these Texas lawmakers back to Austin to complete their job, whether they run out of money or they themselves are in fear of losing their day jobs back home. So I certainly would keep that in mind. And Chuck, I think you're exactly right that the national or the federal narrative is starting to shift. You know, we saw this after Georgia, where Stacey Abrams and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they laid into the Georgia bill. They started calling for those boycotts, and then MLB moved that all-star game from Atlanta to Denver. And then all of a sudden, when you had $100 million worth of economic loss to Atlanta, people started to backtrack. We didn't really mean to boycott. We just meant, maybe don't go as far as this bill. So words have impact. Words have policy impact. And I think that's what you're going to see here the next 10 days with Texas, is that their words, their meetings is going to have an impact on the state. And what that impact does is going to drive the narrative for really the next 2 years. And I guarantee this will be top of mind for voters in 2022. And so those moderate Democrats, especially if they're from a swing or a battleground district, they don't like this, because everyday average Americans like you and me, we don't like this. I don't like the idea that you can walk away from your job and you could just, completely give up to your duties and not fight and not have a debate. That's what you were there to do. So I think they've overplayed their hand. And I think on the national side of things, hopefully and eventually soon, you're going to see this not end well for them, both in the polls, but then also just the sentiment of everyday average Americans that want to see their elected officials do their job.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Senator Hughes. Unfortunately, it's already at the bottom of the hour. We have a lot more questions, and if we had more time, we'd be able to go through them. showing, I guess, how much interest there is in this. And it's important, of course, that there is so much interest because it's such a foundational issue to our representative democracy. Again, I'd like to thank Jessica Anderson, the Executive Director of Heritage Action, for joining us today. I'm presuming from Washington, D.C. Maybe you could say hello to some of our fugitive lawmakers out there. And Senator Bryan Hughes as well, the chair of the State Affairs Committee in the Texas State Senate. Thank you so much for your participation. And thank you for watching our presentation this Monday. For those of you who are interested in this issue and would like to become more involved, we urge you to visit the website keeptexastexan.org. That's keeptexastexan.org. And you can use that site to directly contact your local legislators about this and other important issues. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Chuck DeVore with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Have a great afternoon.